Yes.
Okay. Welcome. I want to welcome everyone. And before we get to the business part of the meeting, I did want to take a minute and introduce first our new commission member and also the head of our Office of Forensic Services at DCJS, Brian Gestring. We were fortunate enough to get Brian from the New York Police Department Crime Lab. He's been with us, what, about a month now, or 2 months? All right, and very happy to have him both in the office and on the commission, so welcome. The other thing I wanted to do is just take a minute and thank Gina Bianchi. Gina, since as long as I've been here and for many years before that, has been kind enough to serve in at least 2 capacities at DCJS and also with the commission, both in a role as counsel and also running our Office of Forensic Services, and serving as counsel to the commission and also serving as a commissioner. It's been a great deal of work. Done a great job, Gina. Now with Brian moving into his position, Gina will move off of the commission, but she will continue in her role as counsel to the commission. But certainly, personally and on behalf of everyone in the commission, I want to let you know how much we appreciate the work that you've done. We'll miss you as a commissioner, but certainly are happy that you'll be continuing as counsel.
Thank you.
We did get a little something for you, too. We have a plaque here which indicates in recognition of your years of dedicated service and your many contributions to the New York State Commission on Forensic Science, to Gina Bianchi. It's even got a very pretty green there instead of the normal plaque. Just for you, Gina. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Look, under already.
Yeah, she was very relieved when we hired Brian. She was very happy that he got a good review from the New York Police Department there. So thank you, Phil. In terms of business, the first item on our agenda is approval of the meeting agenda that was sent around. I assume everyone had a chance to review it. Do I have a motion in that regard?
I just have one question on that, Michael.
Yes, Peter.
Yeah, I understand that NICLAC had a meeting last week, and they discussed report writing. Since that's been an ongoing discussion, I was just hoping somebody might give us an update on where they're at some point during the meeting, not for a substantive discussion about what to do, but just an update.
Kathy, do you have any opposition to that?
I don't. I didn't prepare anything, but I can give a brief update.
All right, as long as it's with the condition that it's just for an update and we'll reserve any substantive discussion for a later date, that's fine.
Great, thanks.
We'll add that under new business. All right, with that addition, do we have a motion to approve the meeting agenda? All right, Brian, do we have a second? Thank you, Ann. All in favor? Anybody opposed? Thank you. Our next item is a review and approval of the minutes of our June 15th, 2012 meeting. Those minutes were sent around to the commission members. I would note that there is one typographical error on page 12 of the minutes. It should read OIG for Office of the Inspector General. And on one spot on page 12 it reads IOG. So I would move to amend that one item in the minutes to read OIG. And with that amendment, first ask if there are any other amendments, and if not, ask if we have a motion to approve the minutes of our June 15th meeting.
Amendment, page 10, paragraph 3. It's in reference to a discussion on blind proficiency testing. I'd like the minutes to reflect my request of Mr. Bowman in the Monroe County Department of Public Safety. His assessment of the possibility of introducing specimens into the laboratory as blind proficiency testing specimens, disguising them as case work. I had asked that he consider that request and comment in his top to bottom report of operations in Monroe County Laboratory.
Is there any discussion on that item?
I remember you bringing that up at the meeting. I guess, I'm not sure if it's fair to ask a person in public safety. It seems to me that should be something that needs to be worked out to the laboratories and discussion with them, not just a person of public safety, because I'm not sure they would be aware of what would be required to create a proficiency test.
No, we discussed that last meeting. There are two requirements for blind proficiency testing. One is to acquire the material that's suitable for blind PET. The second is introducing them into the laboratory as blind specimens. And my request to Mr. Bowman was to address the second requirement. In fact, could he take specimens provided to him and mask them as casework and introduce them into the laboratory? So there are two issues.
And your recollection is that you made that request and
No,
his
Mr.
response was what?
To assess whether he could take specimens, disguise them as casework, and introduce them into the laboratory. I had suggested controlled substances. I think Barry Scheck added the specialties of, actually they are listed here.
In your motion to amend, did you indicate that he had responded to your request?
He has not responded to
Not,
me.
right, but I'm saying during the course of the meeting, you made this request.
Yes.
And are you indicating, did he take a position?
No, it seemed that he accepted.
Well, those are two different things.
A request was made and there was no statement that.
All right, so your motion is to add in the minutes that you made that request of him.
Correct. That's all. I just would like the record to reflect the discussion and the request to Mr. Bowman.
Should we vote on that addition first before we vote on the minutes?
Yes.
All right, so we've got, as I understand it, then you're making a motion to amend the proposed minutes.
Correct.
Okay, so I think the first thing we ought to do is vote on that motion, have that decided one way or the other, then vote on the minutes. So does everyone understand what we're voting on first? Well, Dr. Jenny has made a motion to amend the minutes to add the statement that he just referred to regarding the blind proficiency testing, as he's indicated. Is there a second for that motion? All right, there's a second. Everyone in favor of amending the minutes to reflect that statement or conversation by Dr. Jenny?
You're asking to vote to
Yes.
include that in the
Yes.
Yes. Anyone opposed? All right, so with that addition now, do I have a motion to approve the minutes? All right, do I have a second? All right, all in favor of approving the minutes of the June 15th meeting with the addition we just voted on? Anybody opposed?
Abstain because it wasn't happening.
That's a good reason to abstain. Okay, thank you. Moving right along. Our next set of issues relates to laboratory updates or accreditation items. For that meeting, I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
The first issue under this portion of the meeting is actually Yonkers Police Department Laboratory. And at the June 2012 meeting, they were granted a 100-day extension by the Commissioner of Forensic Science, which expires on December the 12th. They actually requested from ASCAD Lab a 3-month extension, which is also part of this packet. ASCAD Lab provided them with a 6-month extension. So this is not for a vote, it's for informational purposes. So, anyone has any questions on that?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Under this tab, there's a corrective action request, page 5 of 8. It regards clause number 4.13.2.1 regarding laboratory retention records of original observations. A finding that the laboratory did not maintain documentation to establish an audit trail of mobile phases or reagents to the original supplier. Is it possible first for somebody to tell me what are mobile phases? And secondly, what is this all about?
Do we have someone from Yonkers here?
We do.
Just identify yourself.
All right, Chris Cheney, Lab Director, Yonkers Police Department, Forensic Science Laboratory. All right, mobile phases are used in high-performance liquid chromatography. They are made up, in our case, of two different reagents. We use a buffer and methanol and water, sorry. There's also water involved. What this is about is the fact that when chemicals come into the laboratory, they are received into our stock room, and at some point in time they're taken out to be made up into reagents such as the mobile phase. We do identify that a reagent is made up and put a expiration date on it, but before this for this finding, we were not linking it back to the actual bottle that came out of the stock room. So you get a gallon bottle, a 4-liter bottle out of the stock room. It had a lot number on it, but we weren't linking. We would put what lot number we used, but we weren't linking it to an actual bottle, and that was what they would like us to do.
What's the danger in not doing that?
The danger in not doing that is if there is something wrong with your mobile phase or your reagent, that you cannot tell whether it's the individual bottle that was contaminated or the entire lot from the supplier. So if we order, like we usually order 3 cases of HPLC grade water, which is 4 bottles per case. So you would get 12 bottles, they would all have the same lot number from the company. You couldn't tell whether one bottle was wrong or whether one bottle had something wrong with it or whether all 12 bottles had something wrong.
This particular oversight, was this something that was purely an oversight on your part, or was it not understanding the ASCLD lab guidelines to do this, or just it was unclear, it was a mistake? What was the reason for this?
It was, this is our first inspection under ISO, under the international program. This is something that is looked for under the 17025 guidelines, not so much under the old legacy guidelines, and it was just an oversight. We are
Thank
now,
you very much.
well, just so you know, we're now identifying the bottles individually as they come into the laboratory and tracking them that way.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Next item is the New York City Medical Examiner's Office Toxicology Laboratory, and it's the notes from a mid-cycle review.
Did you skip something?
Sorry, Suffolk County. Back up one. Thank you. So Suffolk County, first thing you have is a letter to from Suffolk County to ASCLD for an extension of their accreditation. They're scheduled for an ISO evaluation on October 22nd, and they're requesting an extension of their accreditation. So they did that to ASCLD Lab. ASCLD Lab has granted them a 6-month extension. So they are now asking the Commissioner of Forensic Science also for an extension. This is something that would require a vote.
I would propose that we grant them, or that there be a motion to grant them a 6-month extension. So I guess I would make the motion to grant them a 6-month extension, which would put them well beyond their next meeting. Is there a second for that motion?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor? Anyone opposed? Thank you. Peter and Marvin, did you vote on that?
I was in favor.
Oh, thank you. Peter?
I was in favor.
Thanks.
Sorry, now we can actually get to the New York City Medical Examiners. These are the notes from a mid-cycle review. So again, for informational purposes, there's no vote necessary.
Any questions or discussion on those items?
Ask a question? Sure. So help me God.
Okay. Last item is actually the Onondaga County Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. There's documentation from their mid-cycle review and also a letter from ADFP.
You Are there any questions or any discussion with regard to the Onondaga County Health Department Forensic Toxicology Lab?
Is Mark here?
Yes.
Oh.
Get the hot seat. Thank you.
And Mark. We have a letter from ABFT commenting on your performance or practices in proficiency testing. We don't have a response. Could you comment on their observations?
Yes, I had written a letter to the DCJS after the first incident, the first mention of the buprenorphine. And I have that letter here. I can read it to you, or... Okay. Let me back up a minute. A false positive is pretty much the cardinal sin of any toxicology laboratory, so I took this quite seriously and did what I thought was appropriate corrective action. I received notification of the result on April 18th, and we had detected this buprenorphine by an ELISA test. The case history for the particular proficiency cycle cried out for a test for buprenorphine, and so I tried to treat it to the greatest possible extent as I would a real case, and ordered the buprenorphine test. However, I don't have a confirmatory test. The test that we use, which is an immunological-based assay, is very good for finding negatives, but not so hot at proving that something is there. And we didn't have a more specific technique to show that it was, in fact, buprenorphine. So we reported our findings to CAP as positive for buprenorphine. My biggest concern was there any effect on casework? And so I had performed retrospective study of all samples screened for buprenorphine by ELISA and found 7 such cases. 5 were negative and reported as such. 2 were reported as positive screen result, and both were sent to a reference laboratory. The reference laboratory confirmed 1 case as positive, and the other is not detected, and these findings were reported to the customer. I then performed some corrective action experiments to see if I could determine what the source of the error was. All of the serum samples with that particular proficiency testing were positive for buprenorphine by our assay. So it must have been some preservative or the way that these samples were prepared by CAP that triggered our immunoassay result. We also sent the sample to a reference laboratory to see if it did in fact contain buprenorphine, and it did not. So my conclusion was that some component, drug matrix, preservative, or sample container in the serum batch used in the preparation of these samples caused a false positive reaction with our ELISA assay. The solution to the problem is to develop a confirmatory test by a more sensitive and specific method.
Okay, I have a couple of questions related to that case. First of all, if this were authentic casework, screened positive for buprenorphine, would you have referred that, or would you, for confirmation, or would you have reported that as positive or presumptively positive?
We could have done it 2 ways.
By your old
In the
SOP.
cases that we did, we actually sent it to a reference laboratory. The 2 cases that we did screen positive, we did send it to a reference laboratory. What we could have done and did not do is we could have issued the ELISA result as positive and saying with a caveat to the customer that this is a result from a preliminary screening test, no confirmatory analysis was performed.
Is that your practice?
Yes.
Was that your practice?
Yes.
Okay. So you had 2 options when you have a screen positive. To report it as such, that it's positive by initials for screen testing is not confirmed,
Yes.
or in fact refer that specimen to a reference laboratory for confirmatory testing.
Yes,
And what would you do with the result from the reference laboratory?
we would just include it in our report.
As being tested by that reference laboratory, or as your own report?
We would make a reference to the customer that there was another report, and the customer would actually see the reference laboratory's report in toto.
Okay. This was a proficiency test specimen. You accepted, you scheduled, you processed to the extent that your laboratory routinely processes casework.
Yes.
And you reported, and knowing, why didn't you refer that specimen to your reference lab?
I'm not allowed to for a proficiency sample.
That's CAP policy.
Yes, sir.
Is that ABFT policy?
I would imagine it is.
So if you did not refer for confirmation testing, because in proficiency testing, you don't do that. You only process to the extent that work is done in your own laboratory.
That's
So
correct.
reported a positive. How did you report to CAP? What options does CAP provide for reporting?
Very few. When you report to CAP, you have a series of boxes which are filled with numeric entries. One is for a code for the identity of the drug. Another would be a code for the technique that you use to detect that drug. And a third would be a numerical value if appropriate.
All right, so the PT program in which you participate, it expects or requires confirmation testing?
Yes.
Okay. So what is ABFT's guidance to those laboratories who screen only and don't confirm in the way of proficiency testing? What's your alternative?
I guess my alternative is to not order testing on proficiencies if I don't have a confirmatory technique.
But then you lose the opportunity to proficiency test assays being performed in your laboratory.
That's correct.
Are there PT programs for screening only?
Yeah, I believe there are, yes.
So you couldn't enroll in those, or does ABFT not identify screen only?
ABFT requires us to participate in proficiency testing that includes confirmation. I assume we would be free to enroll in additional proficiency testing programs.
So this discussion presumes that ABFT allows screen-only reporting, as long as there's the caveat that it's not confirmed. Is that true? Or does ABFT disallow reporting of unconfirmed results?
It's my understanding of the ABFT regulations that reporting unconfirmed results is allowable as long as there are sufficient caveats to ensure that the customer knows that.
Okay, the letter from ABFT didn't reflect that. And in fact, your description of the case, how you handled proficiency testing, would suggest that you didn't need to implement any corrective action, that you did what's required of you. You processed to the extent that you do, you reported a finding, you didn't have the option to state as presumptively found. Perhaps your one error was to subscribe to a program that requires confirmation. Therefore, you were issued a false positive. Correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. So I guess what we're looking...
That was not an error. ABFT does require that we participate in that particular proficiency. I think what Graham Jones was suggesting in his letter was not to report to the provider results that were not confirmed. Because this was, there were a lot of other substances that were tested for in that particular proficiency. Buprenorphine was not just one of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, the question is, what is a laboratory to do if they screen only and don't confirm? In the context of proficiency testing, we do want our labs to participate in PT.
Well,
and to be evaluated by the provider.
And I think there's a corollary question of what if buprenorphine was present, if there's a presumptive positive, and the laboratory doesn't report it, would it be wrong if they don't report that because they don't do a confirmatory?
Well, usually the provider does not penalize you for false negatives, which I don't necessarily agree with. But they will penalize you for false positives. The other thing that we do, because all of these PTs are not specifically designed for our program. So after we get the results from the provider, we, as the laboratory, evaluate our results and decide whether this was within our acceptable results. And in a case like this, I would say that, as Mark explained, he couldn't have sent it out for confirmation to a reference laboratory because it was a PT. And that would be my explanation of what happened. And I think that that's acceptable as far as the laboratory is concerned.
Well, CAP does make
The
available.
laboratory, for example, we don't screen for buprenorphine. So I would have gotten a false negative simply because, or I would have, in my evaluation, I would have written that this test is not routinely performed by the laboratory.
Well, I don't know how prevalent in toxicology laboratories it is to screen only and to report unconfirmed findings, but if it's prevalent, there are PT programs designed for screening or initial testing only. That might be an option made available to labs such as Mark's that would be recognized by ABFT.
But ABFT, as Mark pointed out, specifically wants us to participate. This was a CAP, Mark?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we're required to participate in that program, but we're not required to identify everything that is in the PT specimens if that is not something that we routinely do in the laboratory, if that makes sense.
I think, speaking for myself, I understand the point you're making, and I think at some point it may go more toward what we want to require of our labs than the specific issue with the Onondaga lab here.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions with regard to Onondaga?
Well, just a quick discussion on the second error.
This was the opposite case. This time we missed something. So a bit of background is in order. You all know what oxycodone is, Percocet, OxyContin. It breaks down to another narcotic opiate called oxymorphone, which is a metabolite, and recently, or not so recently, a few years ago, was approved by the FDA for oral use. Prior to that, it had only been available in injectable form. This created all kinds of problems for we toxicologists because the use and abuse of Opana, oxymorphone, have risen dramatically, so we need to be able to detect that. We have a screen test, an immunoassay, that will pick up oxycodone and oxymorphone. But we don't know if it's oxycodone or oxymorphone or both, or in some cases possibly neither, because it is a non-specific screening test. So we knew the oxymorphone was, or we suspected that the oxymorphone was there by inference because we can test for oxycodone, and we found that to be negative. So we assumed that the oxymorphone was present, but there was no way to report that to CAP.
This narrative suggests that it was positive for that it screened. Oh, how do you know it was negative for oxycodone?
We
By your
tested.
screen.
We tested. For
Oh, so you wanted a confirmation
We have
that
a-
did
yes.
not detect oxycodone.
We have a confirmatory test for oxycodone, but not for oxymorphone.
Okay, well, this text doesn't state that. This text suggested that oxycodone was found to be positive, and they're questioning why you are reporting oxymorphone.
I think I understand. My letter to ABFT probably could have been clearer in what our testing capabilities were.
No, I understand your discussion fully. I'm just questioning the letter from Dr. Jones on what actually had been reported. The way I read this is that you found oxycodone. They're questioning why would you mention oxymorphone.
If I recall correctly, T1 contained both oxycodone and oxymorphone,
Oh,
and T5 contained only oxymorphone.
okay, so there are two specimens that are being
Correct.
reviewed here. So what is your response then to their concerns?
Well, I don't really have a response. The solution is to develop a confirmatory test for oxymorphone, and we are working very aggressively on that. Should have that done very soon. And then this problem goes away.
Right. But once again, I'm questioning the intent of the comment by ADFT. I'm not finding that the laboratory is culpable in any way based on what you presented. I agree, obviously, there's value in in-house confirmation, but I don't see this being a real issue. Okay.
All right, anything else? All right, thank you, appreciate it. That takes care of our reports, doesn't it? All right, next we have new business. The first item we have under new business relates to the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Biology. And basically this pertains to a contamination event and some press that surrounded that event. And there's a letter in the materials from ASCLD Lab acknowledging the position statement, and also a letter to ASCLD Lab clarifying what happened with regard to the press event, and also indicating that procedures in the laboratory have been modified to ensure that the contamination database is properly checked before any DNA hit is reported. And again, there's no vote on this, it's just a report. Any questions or comments with regard to this item? All right.
I do have.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Who am I speaking to?
You're speaking to the commission? Oh, okay.
Okay. Oh, Mickey. Okay, good. Mickey's here. Page 2 of 3, third paragraph. It stated that the supervisor informed me he was under the impression that he had to report the match regardless. Could you point to your process improvements where you're addressing that situation?
Yes, so Mackie Prince, Forensic Biology, Office of Chief Medical Examiner. So the person who reported out this hit was a supervisor level 4. So his supervisor is an assistant director. He had not discussed the issue with his assistant director. So in our preventive action, we are now require supervisory consultation in all suspected contamination events. He has the authority to approve this hit discovered by his analyst, but we feel that if he tried to confirm the contamination, he couldn't confirm it, he still had a suspicion, he should have consulted his manager. By us writing this into the procedure now, this is mandatory now.
Would he have ever been in a position where his subordinates would have asked the question of him?
No, because it's a supervisor level 4 or manager are the only ones who can final approve a hit notification.
Okay. You might clarify that point in your process improvement statements about the levels of authority and
Oh, okay.
approving.
No, that's in our CODIS manual, so that is already in place.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions?
That's just a comment. So actually, the person who did this tried to do the right thing,
Yes.
right? They wanted to be transparent.
Yes.
They found something really amazing, and so he reported it right away.
Yes.
The only issue is, because of the publicity that ensued and the misperception of the public and the media, that it resulted in this slight change in procedure so that there would be consultation.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, all in all, it was a good thing when the guy did. Was it a guy, or I don't know if it was a
It was a guy.
It was a
yes.
guy. So he did the right thing.
Yes, he
With the
did.
exception of going to the higher end.
He did not make a mistake.
Right.
Yes.
He tried to do.
I just wish he had waited for another day, because the following day we had discovered that it was.
Well, if he had waited for a Saturday, the Daily News wouldn't have published.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
Nothing further, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Marvin. All right, any other discussion on this point? Thank you. All right, the next issue we have is the Monroe County Crime Lab. There are a few items here. The first is a letter to ASCLD Lab dated July 27th of this year from Monroe County, indicating that they're seeking a postponement with regard to their assessment for digital evidence. Are there any and I should note that we have John Clark here from the Monroe County Public Safety Lab. Any questions or comments with regard to that first item? All right, the second item we have deals with a review of prior inspection reports. At our previous meeting, I believe there was a request made by one or more of the commission members to see past inspection reports. There's a letter in the materials from DCJS to ASCLD Lab requesting those reports as well as additional documentation. There's a response from ASCLD Lab, and the inspection reports from November 3rd, 2011 and September 13th, 2008 were sent to the commissioners. In addition, we were informed by ASCLD Lab that there were no notes maintained in connection with those inspections. There's also a letter attached from ASCLD Lab dated September 11th of 2012 regarding their review of the previous inspection reports related to the OIG report. I guess at this point I'd open it up if there are any comments or any questions with regard to this item, or particularly any questions for Monroe County.
Marvin? Michael, is there anybody here from Monroe County?
Yes, John Clark, would be the acting laboratory director, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Good afternoon.
Mr. Clark, my name is Marvin Schechter. I'm one of the members of the commission. I had a few questions for you about these two reports and about the letter from ASCLD Lab. First, let me point your attention to page 21 of the 2008 report. Let me know when you're at that, Mr. Clark.
Okay.
Here's it in the middle of the page. There's an item that says the inspection team was not presented with documentation of compliance for the following important and desirable criteria, which were scored no during the initial inspection. 1.4.3.3 (I). Was each examiner proficiency tested annually in each subdiscipline in which casework was performed? So the answer to that was no in 2008. Am I correct?
I'm sorry, which criteria was that, sir?
It's on page 21.
Okay.
If you go to the middle of the page, you'll see a bold wording under the word supplemental finding.
Yes.
Laboratory. Okay, right beneath that, there's a paragraph. And it says the inspection team was not presented with documentation. Do you see that?
Yes, I do, sir.
And then right under that, 1.4.3.3 (I), it says, was each examiner proficiency tested annually in each subdiscipline in which casework was performed? You see that?
Yes, I do.
So the answer to that one in 2008 was no. Am I correct?
Yes, you are correct.
The next one down is original inspection finding, 1.4.3.4, again, (I). Trace evidence and firearms tool mark examiners have not been proficiency tested annually in each subdiscipline in which casework was performed. And again, no compliance. Am I correct?
Yes.
Excuse me, Marvin, can I just ask?
Yeah.
I think, unless I'm wrong here, but I think you're reading them backwards. Like the original inspection finding comes after the number. So
Okay.
1.4.3.3, the finding was underneath it, if that makes sense. And then,
Okay.
I just want to make that clear, that the finding is underneath the number.
Okay,
Okay?
okay. But do we agree, Dr. Corrado, that it still comes out that there was no compliance?
Yes, except what I'm saying is that that's the same finding. It's not two different findings. So,
That's fine. I
Okay.
accept that.
okay.
Okay, Dr. Clark? I'm sorry, is it Dr. Clark?
No, sir, Mr. Clark.
Mr. Clark? If you can turn then to the 2011 proficiency testing, the ASCLD lab inspection for 2011. Page 22. You see that?
Page 22?
Correct. It's titled the Monroe County Crime Laboratory Inspection Report dated November 3rd, 2011. Page 22.
Okay.
At the very bottom of page 22, there's a statement. The inspection team was not presented with documentation of compliance for the following important criteria, which were scored no during the initial inspection. Then the 1.4.3.3i was each examiner proficiency tested annually in each subdiscipline in which casework was performed. Then underneath that, there's the original inspection finding. Again, same thing, not proficiency tested annually. And I accept Dr. Corrado that that's the same finding at the bottom of page 22, both paragraphs. So here's my question, Mr. Clark. It would appear from just a surface reading of the 2008 to 2011 that on the issue of proficiency testing of some of the technicians, that it did not occur in 2008. And when we fast forward to 2011, we find the same thing. So the first question I have is, what's happening and what's going on, and what did you notice that I'm noticing?
In some of those instances, there would be in the trace analysis section, and there's so many sub-disciplines within that area, it's not possible to test or conduct a proficiency test for every cycle. And in the firearms unit, we have the sub-discipline of tool mark examination. And again, not every examiner within that section does tool mark examinations. Most of them are essentially firearms examiners and don't participate in the tool mark proficiency.
When the test is reported out of the lab on the sheet as to what the results were of that particular test by the technician who has not been proficiency tested, is that indicated on the lab report?
No, if they're not proficiency tested in that area, they wouldn't be conducting that testing.
I lost you on that. I'm reading this, that people who are not being proficiency tested are conducting that work, and it's going out, even though there's not time or it's not possible to do proficiency testing. Am I wrong?
Not in the firearms discipline. We have one person that does not conduct tool mark examinations. Therefore, they do not take the tool mark proficiency test.
But
Well, let me try.
Sorry, Morgan, but do they do tool mark cases?
No.
Okay, so the instances that you have where someone does not do a proficiency, they're not performing that examination?
Yes, and I would have to check that data with the trace analysis unit.
So is this more a failure of maybe the manual to indicate that certain people are qualified or not qualified in certain disciplines? Or there's more of an internal understanding that this person doesn't do that type of case, as opposed to a specification that this person doesn't do this type of case?
Yes.
So let me be sure I understand it. Nothing's coming out of Monroe County that's reported out as a result that is not being done by somebody who is proficiency tested. Anybody who's not passed a proficiency test is not reporting out work.
I would have to check that with the trace evidence section. I'm not sure of that right now.
But Michael, if I may, you're the chair. If we could have Mr. Clark check that and get back to us with a letter, that would be helpful.
If I could just add something in this, the caption that was pointed out on page 22.
Of which report?
The 2011. 2011. Just going back, the 2008 report specifically states that that finding is limited, as I read it, to trace and tool mark. And looking at the 2011 report, I don't see, unless I'm missing something, that that statement is limited to trace or tool mark.
That's exactly correct. That was my next question. It seems that the 2011 report is even broader. The first one, in 2008, was much more limited.
Let me finish my question, if I can, to Mr. Clark. Do you have any understanding one way or the other as to whether or not the statement in the 2011 report is limited to trace and tool mark, or as you sit here today, do not know?
I do not know.
All right. In addition to checking on what Marvin has asked you to look into with regard to the trace section for the 2008 report, will you also do that same analysis for us with regard to the 2011 report in this general statement, and look at whether or not across the laboratory there's anyone who's reporting out results in any discipline or sub-discipline who has not passed proficiency testing?
Yes.
Now, does that address what you were getting at, Marvin?
It does. And if you do find, Mr. Clark, that there has been work that has been reported out by somebody not proficiency tested, is that noted in the final report that's given to the district attorney and eventually to the defense?
No, that would not be on the report.
Would it be your recommendation, Mr. Clark, if you found that we had work that was being reported out by somebody not proficiency tested, that it would be a good idea to note that on the report so that the DA and the defense attorney and the court could evaluate that report in a much more transparent light?
I think it would be much better to have that person proficiency tested, to have everyone proficiency tested, rather than have anybody write a report that's not participating in the proficiency test program.
We both agree on that, and I'm just in the situation that I've posed because of the way I've looked at the reports and the way Mike has taken a look at them. If you do find that there's work being sent out by somebody not proficiency tested, even though that's the preference, would it still be a good idea on the final report for the purposes of lab test reporting to indicate that the person was not proficiency tested during that cycle?
If you can answer it, fine. If you can't, and your previous answer answered it the best you can, that's fine too.
Yeah, I think I answered it the best I can, and that's a situation where I have to discuss with the users or customers of the laboratory.
And the customers of the laboratory in this sense would be?
The agencies submitting evidence, as well as the criminal justice system as a whole.
Well, would that be anybody in the defense bar, the court, or
Absolutely.
Just the DAs?
The defense bar as well, yes.
Okay. Michael, I have a second set of questions. I'll try to be.
If I could follow up.
If we can, we have some other questions here. Maybe we can give some other people a shot, and then we'll come back to you.
That's perfectly okay.
Yeah. I'd like to comment that there are actually two standards that address proficiency testing in sub-disciplines. The first is what you cited, Marvin, as being important, was each examiner proficiency tested annually in each sub-discipline in which casework was performed. The answer was no. And another standard, which is essential, was each examiner proficiency tested at least once during the previous 5-year accreditation cycle. And they were cited as being compliant there. So all individuals appear to have been proficiency tested. It's the question of how frequent that proficiency testing is. All right? So all your questions or statements are couched in, was an individual proficiency tested? The answer is yes, within the past 5 years. Annually, no.
Okay.
Just for the record, this is an important criteria that it's under legacy, so that they were not required to meet this sub-discipline testing annually, PT testing, so that it was not a requirement in legacy accreditation.
It's just important. It's one of those that you can ignore as long as you are compliant with 90% of the importance.
Anyone else here? Marvin, anything further?
I had a second set of questions.
Okay.
Before addressed to the commission and to some extent to Mr. Clark. This 2011 test, dated November 3rd, 2011, is a bit of a misleading because it really involved an inspection that took place from October 18th through the 24th of 2010, followed by an ASCLD lab in-house review of that inspection from December 4th, 2010 to July of 2011. In addition, after that in-house review by ASCLD lab, there was a follow-up visit by a member of the inspection team that took place on October 5th, 2011. We have before us, as you pointed out, Michael, a letter dated September 11, 2012 from ASCLD lab, which indicates that they have complied with our request and have sent the materials to us. But in the second paragraph of the September 11, 2012 letter, they state the following, quote, each of the inspections in question was conducted under the ASCLD lab legacy accreditation program, and no notes from inspectors were maintained by ASCLD lab. On May 29th or March 29th, I'm not sure, of 2011, Mr. Keaton and Mr. Jarvis of ASCLD lab appeared before this commission. They gave a presentation, and in response to questions by Mr. Scheck, directed at Mr. Keaton and Mr. Jarvis, they indicated that they had not read and were not familiar with the 2008 Inspector General's report on the Veters scandal in upstate New York, in the New York Police Department's Forensic Investigation Center out of Albany. Mr. Scheck followed that question up by asking Mr. Keaton and Mr. Jarvis if they could go back and look at the inspection team's notes for the Veter incident with a view towards making improvements in the ASCLD lab guidelines. Mr. Keaton responded that ASCLD lab does not keep such notes. They did not do that. And then Mr. Keaton said, but we have since remedied that situation. So my question is this. I could understand in March of 2011 or May of 2011 when Mr. Keaton said those words that maybe they had not put into effect the new policy of keeping notes for an exam or inspection team that took place on October 18th to the 24th of 2010. But here, after that, there was an in-house review by the inspection team which extended all the way into July of 2011. And then there was a follow-up visit in October 5th, 2011. So where are the notes from the in-house review and the follow-up visit on October 5th, 2011? Now, the answer to that question may very well be that when Mr. Keaton uttered the words to Mr. Scheck, we have since remedied that problem of note-keeping, that perhaps he was being flexible in his use of language as to when the note-keeping function had been remedied. So my question, Michael, to the Commission and to Mr. Clark is, since we depend so heavily on ASCLD lab for accreditation, what is their policy on the keeping of notes from the inspection team, in-house reviews, and the follow-up? When was the policy put into effect so that we can make these demands for notes in the future? How are they keeping the notes? Is it being done by storage by hand? Are they scanning it? Is it in a computer? And what exactly is their policy on note retention? What does it cover? Does it cover the inspection team, the follow-up visit, the in-house reviews? And I think we need to know that, because it seems to me that the problem we're having is that the accreditor is not keeping key notes that the commission needs and depends on when it looks back. We have this problem with Nassau County, we have this problem with the Beavers incident, and now we have Monroe County, we have no notes. The irony of the situation is that month after month the commission meets and ASCLD Lab criticizes the labs for not keeping proper notes, particularly in the latent print area. I think it was Ann Willey who, at the March 29th or May 29th meeting, said to Mr. Keaton, you know, it might be a good idea for ASCLD Lab to look at themselves and their guidelines before they tell the labs what it is they have to do. So, Michael, what I'm asking is, based on this letter of September 11, 2012, is that the commission send a letter to ASCLD Lab along the lines that I have suggested with those questions, so we can get an answer once and for all as to where these notes are, what the policy is, how they're kept, etc. I will tell you, Michael, that for the October meeting of this commission, I intend to propose that the commission accept as a rule in the state of New York that any accrediting agency that we have should, as a matter of the rule of the state of New York set by this commission, keep all of its handwritten notes or other notes in any medium whatsoever of all their inspections, in-house reviews, and follow-ups as a matter of course.
I have 2 points. As to the October meeting, my recollection is that that meeting is limited to a consideration of the Inspector General's report with regard to Nassau. So we'll have to look at whether or not that might not be more appropriate for the December meeting. As to your first point, we will gladly make inquiry of ASCLD Lab with regard to the issues you raised concerning notes. And I would suggest that you send Brian Gestring a draft of a letter containing the points that you just raised, and then we will take that draft and put it into a final letter and make the request.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else with regard to this particular issue on Monroe County? There's nothing further on this. We'll move on to, and actually under new business, in fairness to you, Peter, you indicated that you had one point you wanted to raise under new business.
It wasn't a point I wanted to raise. We asked Catherine if she would just give us an update on what happened at the NICLAC meeting on the subject of report writing.
Would you like me to do that now?
Please.
So NICLAC met and had decided to enlist the Twigs in helping us look at the standardized report writing. And so what we had asked the Twigs to do was to get together and to sort of come up with a list of the different types of reporting statements that they have so that we could see how the different labs report things and to hopefully eventually come up to a consensus. And many of the Twigs started that process and provided us with a draft document of some of the reporting statements that they had compiled. What we realized when NICLAC reviewed this information, what we realized is, as you might expect, that raised more questions that we had. In particular, there were some questions relating to different scenarios. So when we can see reporting statements, how they report things, sometimes there's different scenarios that come up in the different disciplines, and each scenario may require a different type of reporting statement. So basically what we did is we reviewed the work that they have done to date, the draft they provided, and we are now tasking the Twigs with additional work. One of the things we're tasking them with is to identify the terms and define the terms that are used on the reports, and to define those terms, such as the term identified or the term detected. You know, what are those terms and how are they defined? So we're asking the Twigs to try to compile a list of the terms used in reports, how their labs use them, and how their labs define them. And then when we have that compiled, hopefully try to build a consensus such that we might all be talking, the same language, if you will. The second thing we asked them to do is to try to identify, it's kind of an oxymoron, but to try to identify the most common different types of scenarios. So in each discipline, there might be different types of scenarios that come up that need to be reported differently, to try to identify as many of those as they can, and to compile the way the labs report those, so we can, again, look at those reporting statements and try to see if we can come up with a best practice consensus. So basically, we took some of the information they have, we talked about it, came up with some more questions. We're now going to task back to them to answer some of those and get some more information. Hopefully, when they get that back to us again, we'll look at it and see what we can draft from that. That's basically where we're at.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Sure.
Moving to old business. The first item under old business, again, relates to the Monroe County Crime Laboratory. And there's basically 4 letters attached here under this section. Kind of going in reverse order here. The first is a letter from DCJS from July 10th of 2012 documenting the Commission's request of the Monroe County Lab for a top-to-bottom review. The second is a letter from Monroe County dated July 17th, 2012, summarizing the actions they've taken to date. The third was a letter from DCJS dated August 21st, 2012, regarding an update on the progress of the review that the Commission requested. And the fourth is a letter to DCJS on September 4th of this year, noting actions that the lab is taking following the issuance of the Inspector General's report. And before we go farther on this topic, there was something I did want to indicate to the Commission. At a previous meeting, following the issuance of the Inspector General's report, I indicated that I was going to recuse myself in consideration of any issues related to that report, in particular because of the references in the report to allegations of conduct by the lab director at the time, Janet Sequest Anderson, and specifically relating to allegations that she had basically closed out a number of cases and sent the cases and the evidence in those cases back to police departments and indicated that the statute of limitations had run. As district attorney, I was involved from the DA's office perspective in addressing that particular issue, and I felt that I should not be involved in that issue. It's my understanding that she is no longer with the laboratory. It doesn't appear that that issue is part of any of the issues on the agenda here that we're looking at. I don't feel that I have a conflict with regard to any of the issues on the agenda here. But I just wanted to point that out. And certainly if anyone feels differently or if anyone feels that I do have a conflict or I should be recused, I'd be happy to listen to that. But from my perspective, I think the conflict was specifically with Janet Sequest Anderson and the particular allegation with regard to the statute of limitations. So if there's nothing on the recusal, then are there any either comments or questions for Mr. Clark with regard to the 4 letters that I referred to, and I guess more generally the Commission's request for a top-to-bottom review of the laboratory?
Just some quick questions on the most recent correspondence, the letter from September 4th. When you're describing the audits that have been completed in the different sections, I was just wondering if you could give us maybe a preview, since those audits are already completed, of basically the types of things those audits have identified.
Those audits, which have been completed to date, were in progress at the time the Inspector General's report came out. So we did close those out, implement the recommendations from the Inspector General's report. But those audits included audits of DNA section, all the analytical areas of the laboratory. We looked at 5 case files from each analyst and went through those case files to ensure that the analysts were following proper procedures.
All right, at least in those audits, you didn't find any gross deficiencies?
No.
external to the laboratory? Is there increased interest in improved communications and operations? Again, my view is that this is a breakdown in communication between laboratory and upper management, issues that needed to be addressed. Is there evidence that, in fact, you are receiving the support and attention that's warranted?
Yes, we are, and one of our recommendations was to have a crime laboratory advisory panel, and we had our first meeting September 17th, which was attended by some of our customers who had the interest you spoke of in seeking questions or answers from the laboratory in regards to how we're going to move forward in the future.
Anything else on this issue? All right, our next issue, our next set of issues pertain to lab disclosures. First on the agenda, again, is the Monroe County Crime Laboratory. And there's a letter dated August 24th of 2012. Rather than me summarize the letter, Mr. Clark, if you want to make any statement or just give the commission maybe a brief statement with regard to that disclosure. I should note, too, that this incident was reported to the DNA subcommittee at the September 14th, 2012 meeting.
Yes, this was an instance where an analyst had made an error with the reagent, switching it in order of the run. It was caught during the technical review process prior to the report ever being generated. That analyst was removed from casework and given a proficiency test, which was passed. She was placed under supervised casework, at which point some more inconsistencies arose. They were minor. At that point, the person was taken off the casework, and then we did an audit and decided to reanalyze all of that analyst's casework. And that casework includes 21 cases that analyst worked on independently, as well as 5 cases that were worked on jointly with the senior analyst.
Are there any questions for Mr. Clark or discussion with regard to this issue?
Can you relate the discussion within the DNA subcommittee? Did they raise any questions, concerns, recommendations?
There was talk or questions regarding the use of headphones and music in the laboratory as to whether the person may have been distracted during their analysis. We do allow headphones and music, and we are looking at that as part of our audit, whether we are still going to allow those things.
You should have a sensor.
Point of clarification. So as I understand this, one analyst committed 2 errors. One, in fact, had been reported, and the second is technical error, that another technical error occurred. That's the transcription or switching of specimens that you just referred to?
Yes, I do believe there are more inconsistencies than just 2 in the casework. I can't speak to the technical nature of those, but there were more than 2. And again, all of them were minor as to following proper procedure within the laboratory.
So is this an issue of competency or distraction? I'm not certain what's being addressed.
We're still looking into that. We've reviewed approximately 50% of those 26 cases. We plan on doing 100%. We have found no issues in that past casework, and we believe it's going to be an issue of retraining the analysts.
To what extent have you looked at the other analysts? Do they have practices of using iPods and other devices during their work?
Some do and some do not.
So you haven't changed that policy for other analysts?
No, we have not.
As far as distraction?
And while some people feel that listening to music may drown out other distractions within the laboratory, so we're still looking at that.
Okay.
I'm just, clearly going back and reviewing the cases where the individual's been identified as having technical problem, whatever basis of that might be, is the thing you probably have to do. But I'm curious, in light of the reported long turnaround times on DNA analysis and the problem of large backlogs that led to other problems with the evidence, what kind of a turnaround time workload impact is going back and doing 21 cases having on the DNA lab? I just think we all need to appreciate that when we go back to correct potential problem, it has consequences moving forward. Yes, you want to identify the problem and fix it, but meanwhile, there are new cases that have to wait because. So, can you comment on the impact it's had?
Yes, anytime you have to go back and obviously reanalyze cases, it's very taxing, especially when you're in a situation where you're working with limited resources. But we do believe that it's important to go back and check 100% of those cases to ensure that none of those results were affected.
So you can't quantitate the impact, but it's significant.
Yes.
All right.
Just some quick follow-ups on this. Are you aware of how far the sample mix-up went? Was it something that was detected as the samples were mixed, or was it when the actual profiles were generated?
I do not know when the switch was made.
Okay. One of the things also is, I know this was brought up at the subcommittee meeting, is that the initial incident was in 2011. Just wondering about the delay in reporting.
The initial incident, again, the switching of the blanks, we did not feel was a Class 1 or didn't arise to a Class 1 inconsistency. The person was immediately removed from casework, and then during that time of supervised casework, when the other inconsistencies were found, again, all minor, and we finally removed the analyst from casework again and reassessed the situation. It's at that point that we decided to go ahead and report the incident. And again, prior to us reanalyzing any of that casework, we reported it, and we are about 50% complete with that reanalysis.
And so far, at least from this letter, all the reanalysis have showed that the original results were true?
Yes.
Thank you.
What's going on with that analyst now?
The analyst is performing screening type of casework or technician type duties, as well as some administrative duties.
Has there been any remediation started yet with the analyst to address the issues?
During the initial phases, there was some different types of remediation and counseling with these analysts and the supervisor, but now we're waiting until the casework has been complete to decide on how much retraining will be necessary.
Is her work subject to temporary review for current duties?
Yes.
Is she being monitored?
Yes.
Any other questions on this issue? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. The next two items relate to the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center. The first is documented in at least one letter, and it refers to an incident where, as I understand it, evidence was received at the Western Regional Crime Laboratory consisting of a blood kit, and there was later an allegation by a customer that there were 6 packets of heroin that were submitted by with the blood kit. If I have the anything you want to add to that or any comment?
Our internal affairs section is conducting investigation, and I've not received a report yet.
Any questions or comments regarding that item?
So when evidence is submitted to your laboratory, isn't there a chain of custody with inventory? Shouldn't have it shouldn't it have been recognized that on test order that there were missing items?
Without going into it in great detail, when the evidence was received, there was no submission form received with it.
Is that a violation in any way?
Yes, the submitter was contacted and asked to provide a submission.
How soon after the intake?
It was the day of the intake, the evidence technician contacted the submitter and asked them to submit a submission form for the toxicology kit.
Is that when you learned that in fact there was, well, missing heroin?
No, there was no mention of heroin in the communication between the evidence tech and the submitter.
Just as clarification too, this was received by mail, was it not?
Yes, it was UPS.
All right, so when the UPS package was opened,
There was a blood kit in it. There was no submission. And that's what was logged into our system.
But at the same time, there's a record that you inquired as to the inventory or the
Yes.
expected content.
Yes.
And at that time, they didn't mention the drug packets?
No, not in the initial communication.
Okay.
So when you say that internal affairs to state police and lab is looking into this, but if this drug went missing back at the submitters.
Submitter is another state police entity.
Okay. And UPS, I mean, somebody investigating that.
That's why we have internal affairs.
Okay.
thank you. Any other questions on this issue? Okay, next relates to two letters relating to a false negative serology result. And again, without going through all the letters, is there anything you want to add by way of comment or summary?
No, I think that the corrective action plan is self-explanatory. If there are questions, Dr. Barry Newsman is here, and will this be an answering?
And I should indicate as well that this incident was reported to the DNA subcommittee again at the September 14th, 2012 meeting. Peter?
Yeah, I have some questions. First of all, I'm very pleased, Barry, to see this description of how you go about doing a root cause analysis. It's very comprehensive, it's very thoughtful, and it's great, that that's being done. One of the things that we do at the medical center now in these situations when we do a root cause is the first question we ask is, the reviewers ask, could I have made this same mistake? And if the answer is yes, then it's one of those just sort of one-off situations, and those things happen, right? It wouldn't be outrageous, for instance, for somebody who looked at 300 cases and correctly identified the presence or absence of sperm in 299 to make a mistake once. And so that person may not need any kind of remedial action. But you guys went on, and you then looked at other work by that person and found out of just a subset of 4 cases, it happened again. And as a result of that appropriate checking on your part, you then started to do this root cause analysis. And as I read the letter, and you correct me if I'm mistaken, it seems as if you reached the conclusion that the problem of this analyst was not due to any kind of faulty training. And then 2, it wasn't due to any kind of inexperience. So my question is, and it looks like the way you went about those processes is perfect.
Yeah.
But the question is, so once you eliminate those 2 possible root causes, do you give up on finding a root cause, or do you have a plan C and a plan D? Because the only other plan you mention in this letter is just to see whether or not the problem was more widespread, but still doesn't deal with root cause, or does it?
Well, I think it does. I think once we've finished that plan, that we've pretty much set the baseline that it's not a training issue, it's not an issue of folks being unfamiliar with the protocol, and it's certainly not a systemic issue. And that brings us back to the analyst. And I think what we're seeing there is this actually may have been an instance where the analyst's training is not so much in sperm identification, but in microscopy. And that she actually has said on several occasions that on doing the sperm identification, looking through the microscope, she actually gets motion sickness. And I think she may not be using the microscope appropriately. And I really didn't come to that conclusion until I talked to some outside people last week. And they said that's not an uncommon thing. That may be what's happening. She simply hasn't told us that she may be looking away from the microscope or something, and she thought she was doing fine. But we may have a retraining issue.
Well, the only problem is that they comment on that issue as well here, Barry, at the bottom of the first page. It says, after she mentioned the motion sickness, that a second analyst performed a side-by-side examination of slides with the original analyst and reported that the employee did not appear to have any difficulty in locating or identifying sperm. I see, but it doesn't comment on whether or not she was having motion sickness. I assume if the second analyst saw her having motion sickness, or if the first analyst commented on it, she would have noted that, no?
I wasn't there when they did the side-by-side test, so I don't know if exactly the same conditions that she would have applied to herself when she was doing the examination.
So would you? So it would be the conclusion then of the lab that if you find out that it's not widespread, assuming that's the result, that you'll just say the root cause was most likely the fact that she experienced motion sickness?
I think we would we'd find a way to test that. We'd probably provide her with some competency test of some sort and see if she's able to pass it. Certainly give her some instruction on using the microscope and go forward from there.
There are individuals who simply cannot do microscopy for precisely that reason.
Can't hear you in New York here.
There are individuals who simply cannot do microscopy because of the motion sickness issue. It is not uncommon that an individual, because of motion, that it is a rolling motion, whether you do it this way or laterally, and you can't do it, especially to cover the size of a smear slide that comes from in a rape kit. And you'll know that.
30 minutes peering down the microscope barrel, it can be a lot. We're going to try, retrain and try that. The other thing, of course, is to get her off the microscope entirely. And we have now in the laboratory a joystick which moves the slide, and you can look at a screen and monitor that way. But we have to institute that process first, and that's going to take a little bit of a while. So there are two solutions that we're looking at.
I'm curious, a slide with 3 sperm heads, is that a particularly challenging?
It is a particularly challenging slide. There were 3 sperm and they were basically clustered together, so you could have just missed that part of the slide. That's why in our reports we don't say sperm negative, sperm not observed, because we're not infallible and we realize that. And I think when we presented this to the DNA subcommittee, we got the same response. We had 3 serologists on the subcommittee and they're all shaking their heads that they understand.
Barry, on a related question. I'm sorry, on a related question, people have approached us with, this new technology that they say they've sold to the FBI and some other laboratories that identifies sperm on slides without any kind of human contact. Have you guys explored that possibility, and have you rejected it?
We have explored it, and we're in the process of exploring it further. Right now, I can't say we're having a lot of success with it. We see a lot of false positives. So it actually ends up taking as much time as a manual search. But we're going to continue. I think there is some scope. There are some laboratories that do that. I think the Ohio State Police Lab actually uses an automated system for all their sperm searches.
It's not unlike automated image systems for pap smears. And when to Dick's question, finding 3 abnormal cells on a pap smear is pretty comparable. And these automated systems, they're as good as the scanners, but it still takes tremendous human interface.
Yes.
Thank you.
Quick question on your retest policy. What percentage of the slides are retested before reporting?
We're retesting it every individual is going to get retested at least once a year. We finished retesting all of our DNA examiners last year. That was 44 of them. And now we're going back and retesting all the serologies.
Part of the laboratory reanalysis program.
Yes. Yeah.
That we interact all the labs in.
Okay. I guess in reading this, I read this to mean that before a result is reported, there is a second test.
Only when we're doing a reanalysis. Only on those cases that we retested.
There's 2 different things. There's retesting and there's reanalysis. Retesting is a quality control measure. The initial incident was picked up during retesting.
Right.
Okay. There was no report issued in that case because it's part of the quality control before a report goes out.
So that retesting, what percentage? You're saying all go through a retest?
Yes.
Every
Yeah,
Each examiner,
Each examiner.
not each test.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah.
On routine retesting, a second examiner reported the slide was sperm positive.
Right.
What does that mean? When was that done?
That was done very soon after the initial examiner was completed. We do our retest before we put the report out, so obviously we have to expedite that.
Yeah,
So that was done
okay.
basically a day or two afterwards.
Well,
Thank you. Our next item relates to the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Biology, and it's a update on the reporting of false negative cases, and was reported on at the November 23rd, December 23rd, 2011 meetings, and the May 18th, 2012 meeting. In that regard, there's a letter dated June 27th, 2012, to ASCLD Lab and the materials. Any questions or comments with regard to that item? If there's nothing there, then I believe for anything we have remaining, I would need a motion to go into executive session. Give a second. All in favor? Anybody opposed? Everyone in favor, thank you. And we will go into executive session at this point. I would ask you.
Check the door.
Now I'm told we're all set. So just to clarify for the record, we did go into executive session to discuss matters which could potentially impair the criminal investigation. We're now back on the record in our regular session, and the only thing I have left is that our next meeting dates are October 29th of this year for our meeting with regard to the Inspector General's report regarding Nassau, and then our regularly scheduled December 11th, 2012 meeting. And I believe both of those meetings are scheduled to be in New York City, because we would really like to be with you in person. Does anyone have anything else? We have the motion to adjourn. Seconded. Peter, everyone in favor? Wonderful.
Michael, the only question is whether or not, if the Yankees go all the way, is that meeting date going to interfere?
I was going to say something. I was going to say something, but I don't want to alienate the Yankees fans, so I won't.
All right.
Ours tomorrow.